Today we're going to apply the structural functional perspective to health and medicine. The primary function of the medical and insurance institutions are to keep people healthy and to help sick people become well. This implies that illness impairs our ability to perform our roles in society. If too many people are unhealthy, society's functioning and stability will suffer. We're going to come back to this second idea that Steve Parkin offers us about too many people getting sick. Right now we're going to focus on roles and how roles are central to a functioning society. So social roles and functionalism, these two go hand in hand. If you know your role, you're going to have a functioning society. If you perform your role, you're going to have a functioning society. So what is the healthcare professional's role? The healthcare professional role is the idea that we expect our doctors and nurses to be objective, non-judgmental, unbiased, helpful, caring, knowledgeable. Our doctor or our nurses are supposed to give us our medicine and give us medical advice about how to take care of ourselves and how to get better. On the flip side, we have certain expectations for the person who is sick. This is called the sick role, coined by Talcott Parsons in 1951. So what are the expectations of the sick person? Well, number one, we expect you to have a legitimate sickness. We're going to come back to that idea in a moment. But the idea is that we expect you to have something that we all recognize as an illness. Number two, because you have a legitimate sickness, you are excused from your duties. If you have the student role and we expect you to go to school and take your classes, you are excused from your student role because you have the sick role. So a student will email me and say, Mike, I can't come to class next week. I'm not feeling well. I'm really sick. And I say, okay, you have the sick role that trumps your student role. Similarly, if you work, your boss doesn't want you coming to work as a waiter or a waitress serving people food if you're sneezing and coughing all the time. So again, you have the worker role, but your boss understands that when you're sick, the sick role trumps the worker role, and you don't want sick people at work. So in both instances, you are excused from your normal duties because the sick role is more powerful than the worker role and the student role. Number two, we assume when you have the sick role that being sick is undesirable. And we expect you, as the person who is sick, to work to get better. So part of being the sick role is actually trying to get better. If you tell me, I'm sick, I can't go to school today, and you're coughing and you're sneezing and you're not feeling well, and then I go out to a restaurant that night and I see you at the bar smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, and you're coughing and sneezing, I say to myself, that person is not working to get better. They're actually doing things that does not make them get better. They're smoking cigarettes, they're drinking alcohol, they should be at home eating chicken noodle soup and not smoking cigarettes. So one of the expectations of the sick role is that the sickness is undesirable and the sick person is working towards getting better. They're getting enough sleep, they're not smoking cigarettes, and they're getting their vitamins. The last expectation of the sick role is that you should follow your doctor's orders. If your doctor tells you to stay home and not go to work, you should listen to your doctor. If your doctor tells you to get lots of fluids, we expect you to get lots of fluids. If your doctor tells you to stay off of your ankle, you need to stay off that ankle, not continue using it. So those are the expectations of the sick role. Sickness is undesirable, you work to get better, you are excused from your duties, but you're following your doctor's orders. So the idea here is that some groups might not be granted the sick role. And this is a critique of Talcott Parsons' work, because Parsons was saying, the sick role is this totally functional role that works for our society and makes people get better and helps the social system work. But there are groups of people who are not granted the sick role. So let's talk about who those are. The most important one, and again, I'm sort of sneaking in the conflict perspective here, the most important group that doesn't get granted the sick role are working poor people. A lot of people who are working poor must go to work to pay the bills. And they don't have doctors. It's not like they can go to a doctor and say, hey doctor, can you write me a sick note? They don't have private doctors. They don't have insurance because they're working poor in America. And sometimes even their boss will say to them, you've been sick so many times this year. If you call out sick again, you're getting fired. So they literally might lose their job if they don't show up to work. So they go to work sick. A lot of people who are working poor are living paycheck to paycheck. So not going to work for 2 days means they're struggling to pay the electric bill. It means they're struggling to pay the rent. Those are problems. So one group that is not granted the sick roll are working poor people in the United States. And again, this is a critique of the functional perspective. The functional perspective says everything's great, but the conflict perspective comes in and says, I can critique your concept by pointing out that poor people do not receive it. Another group that does not get the sick roll very often are people who are always sick. People who are like cancer patients, or people who have a really bad illness that's always there. The whole sick roll concept was developed to treat people who were only sick for a short period of time. You have the cold, you have the flu, you have a stomach illness, you have some sort of food poisoning. You are temporarily sick. The sick roll works perfectly for people who have insurance, have sick days, and are temporarily sick. But if you're somebody who is going through cancer treatment, or you have a heart attack, and you stop showing up to work for a month, you stop showing up to work for 2 months, it's hard for your employer to excuse you for such a long period of time. So your employer might say, I'm sorry, but this is too far. I've had students in my own class who have had cancer, or somebody in their family who has had cancer. And after a certain point, it's like, you've missed a lot of class. I don't know how much I can work with you. Maybe this is the semester where you withdraw and you just walk away from your class and you go from there. Because the sick roll was not created for people who are missing huge amounts of time. So groups that are not granted the sick roll are the working poor, people without insurance, people who have a really serious illness like cancer, heart disease, a stroke, a heart attack, who are out of class, out of work for a long period of time. And the last group, and I do want you to emphasize here that these are whole groups of people, are people with mental health issues. Now, in the 1980s and 1990s, when we really talked about this concept, a lot of people didn't understand what mental health and mental illness were. When somebody said they had depression, a lot of bosses would say, come on, man, just be happy. Look at the bright side. They didn't understand the depths and the reality of mental health and mental illness. So whole groups of people who were not granted the sick roll were people with mental illness. Today, I feel like we are moving the target a little bit, and employers and workplaces and teachers are beginning to understand that mental health is a real illness. But for a lot of people, when you tell them, I have a mental health issue, I'm having anxiety, I'm having depression, I have whatever issue it is, a lot of people struggle to grant others the sick roll because they say, well, that's not a legitimate illness. I've been sad before too. Just look at the bright side. Or they say, you're not working to get better. You have to, struggle harder to get better. You have to work really hard to be happy or overcome your anxiety. So we don't understand that mental health is one of those issues where it can actually make a whole group of people not receive the sick roll. And the other thing with mental health illness is that it's sort of like cancer, where you're sort of living with it for the rest of your life usually. So again, the whole sick roll concept was developed for things that were temporary, not permanent, things that we all agreed were real. A lot of people will say things like ADHD or depression isn't a real illness, and that can be problematic for applying the sick roll. So I just want to clarify here. I'm explaining the sick roll. It is useful in certain circumstances, but the concept has been critiqued, and it has been critiqued by the conflict perspective that says, notice the groups that are not receiving the sick roll are groups that are very marginalized in our society. The poor, the mentally ill, and people with sort of these chronic illnesses. The last concept we're going to talk about for structural functionalism is the manifest and latent functions. Manifest functions, to remind you, are the intended function. Why did we create hospitals? Well, to get people well, to deal with emergencies. That's the intended function. What is the manifest function of having a nurse, someone to help a doctor and do certain roles, right? So these are the intended functions. The latent functions are the unintended functions, where humans say, well, it wasn't created for this reason, but it serves a vital social function for a group of people. So, how do you use this concept? Well, like I said, it can be applied to anything. You can apply it to whole institutions like insurance and hospitals and doctors, or you can apply it to technology, a tool, an idea, a role. You can apply it to anything really. So the way we apply it is we ask, why did humans create X? Okay, the intended reason for creating it was X. And we have to ask the question, how did humans use X in an unintended way? Humans had a need for something else, and they said, you know what? This tool, even though it was intended for it, will serve this other function. So let's take a look at an example with the ultrasound machine. What was the intended function of creating an ultrasound machine? What is the unintended way the ultrasound machine has been used?
It's Freakonomics time. That time every couple of weeks here on Marketplace when we explore the hidden side of everything. Today, when a new technology is unveiled, sometimes the unexpected comes along too. Here's Stephen Dubner.
One day, during a reporting trip to Anhui province in China, the journalist Mara Vistendahl visited a family planning office. She saw something strange.
They showed me to the room in their office where the ultrasound machine's kept, and they had actually installed 2 locks on the door.
It was kept under lock and key because...
In some countries where sex selection has taken off, people see this machine as really a way to ensure them a boy.
Since the introduction of the ultrasound in Asia in the early 1980s, it's often been used to determine the gender of a fetus and, if it's female, have an abortion. In a part of the world with big populations, these sex-selective abortions have had a big unintended consequence.
I mean, there are over 160 million females missing from the population in Asia. To put that in perspective, it's more than the entire female population of the United States.
So what happens in a world with too many men? For starters, there's more sex trafficking, more AIDS, a higher crime rate. In fact, if you want to know the crime rate in a given part of India, one surefire indicator is the gender ratio. The more men, the more crime. Now, the ultrasound machine didn't create these problems, but it did enable them. So you have to wonder, what's next?
With a blood test where blood's drawn from the arm, it's zero risk for the baby and essentially zero for the mom.
That's Stephen Quake. He's a biophysicist at Stanford. He has developed a new blood test that will screen for genetic abnormalities like Down syndrome in a fetus. Now, it's typically done now by amniocentesis, which requires sticking a big needle through a woman's abdomen, through the uterus, and into the amniotic sac. A blood test would do away with a lot of that risk, the invasiveness, and the cost, and it would give parents information earlier in a pregnancy.
The overall goal here, I think, is to lower stress. Impending parenthood is a very stressful time.
If more people opt for Quake's blood test, then more people will find out earlier that they have a fetus with a genetic abnormality. So, would we see the end of Down syndrome births? Here's my Freakonomics co-author, economist Steve Levitt.
There are many people now who are willing to put in God's hands whether or not they have a Down syndrome child. And I think those are the kind of parents who, if they have a Down syndrome child, will give loving and supportive households. And then there's a set of parents who desperately want to avoid having a Down syndrome child, who cannot handle financially or psychologically the cost that would come with it.
In other words, just because there's an easier test doesn't mean everyone will want to use it. Levitt, being an economist, doesn't see the situation as simply a moral decision. He sees it as a sorting mechanism.
In a world in which there are 2 different kinds of people, some who welcome Down syndrome children and some who don't, it seems to me that if you have a cheap, easy, safe, reliable test, that's a perfect sorting mechanism to ensure that, in some sense, the right Down syndrome children get born.
Dr. Quake's blood test is in clinical trials now and maybe on the market this year. So we'll start to see the outcomes sooner rather than later. What'll it be? It's hard to say. The future is the future. But don't be surprised if we turn out to be surprised. There are a lot of powerful laws in the universe, but the law of unintended consequences may be one of the most powerful. I'm Stephen Dubner for Marketplace.
The law of unintended consequences. You create something, and people use it for another reason. It's interesting that, somebody might have written the Bible, for example, as a book to create peace. But that doesn't stop somebody from reading the Bible and saying, oh, well, we can justify war with this book. And that's the idea. You can create some sort of technology that you want to use to create clean energy that's going to be very cheap, but somebody can use that same ability to create clean and long-lasting energy to wage war. And again, you might intend to do X, but people use it for Y. You can't stop people from taking anything you've created and changing how they use it. So I have another example for you here. It's looking at the military. I know it's totally different, but I just want to show you how this works. During and after the Vietnam conflict, politicians and economists realized the hard way that many Americans didn't want to serve in the military. There was protests during the Vietnam War. People were burning their draft cards, and it looked very bad that America said, we're going to wage a war in Vietnam, and Americans were protesting against it. There was an anti-war movement in America at that time. So how did they decide to solve the problem? They solved the problem by creating the all-volunteer force. Under President Nixon, they said, we will no longer have a draft. We're going to end the draft. So now it's all about sorting. They reasoned that capitalism helps people sort into who should serve in the military and who should not. If you want to go into the military and have a good career and have great benefits, please join up. If you don't want to join the military because you're some sort of pacifist, you don't believe in America's military, okay, don't join. We don't need you. And it's a good sorting mechanism, because no one today should be standing up saying, I don't believe that we should be in Iraq or we should be in Afghanistan. Well, if you don't believe that, why did you join the military? So the all-volunteer force was a way of sorting people into who should join the military and who should not. Because the draft had an unintended dysfunction. When you said to people, you must serve, we pulled your number out of a hat, and you have to go serve in the military, well, people said, I don't want to. And then suddenly you have resistance, and you don't have a country unified against fighting a war. Today, many Americans ignore the military, and they ignore the war that's going on because they're not being asked to serve. Military families, they care about the war. People who are in the military, they pay attention. They know what's going on. But the rest of Americans are kind of like spectators that really don't pay attention to the war effort. Capitalism has provided a sorting mechanism. And that's what that piece was from with Freakonomics Radio. They were saying that the ultrasound and this genetic testing, all of these things were sort of sorting people out. And they can be problematic, they can be dysfunctional, they can be unethical and immoral, as many young girls are being aborted in Asia. But notice, the person who created the ultrasound machine intended it for one thing, and people used it for other reasons.